Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, wherever you're joining this webinar from. It's a great pleasure to chair this virtual COP27 related panel on how we can make real change to tackle the climate crisis, which is being hosted across the Edgbaston and Dubai campuses of the University of Birmingham. So I'm David Hanna. I'm Director of the Birmingham Institute for Sustainability and Climate Action. I'm a Professor of Hydrology and UNESCO Chair in Water Sciences at the University of Birmingham here in our Edgbaston campus. I do research to better understand how the water cycle works, to understand hydrological events such as floods and droughts, and to understand water-related impacts on ecosystems and people under climate and other drivers of change. I was included in Reuters' world's top most influential climate scientists, down at number 697, and our work has been included in 4 IPCC reports. I'm hosting today's webinar with Dr. Rasha Bayoumi, who is the head of research for our Dubai campus. As you may be aware, the next COP, COP28, is scheduled to take place from the 6th to the 17th of November 2023 in Dubai, and during that the university has plans to host a number of events in country. But back to the here and now. So the University of Birmingham's research is contributing to discussions at the current COP27, with colleagues taking part in a range of different events and activities. Personally, I was very pleased yesterday for the first ever Water Day to be held at COP27, which recognised water as the ultimate climate connector because it impacts in so many ways in which we feel climate change. So to mark COP27, we're holding today's panel event to address the really critical question of how can we make real change to tackle the climate crisis? So the Glasgow COP26 summit was recognised as the world's last chance to keep 1.5 degrees alive and avoid the dangerous climate change impacts that might occur as we go beyond 1.5 degrees temperature rise from pre-industrial levels. That will result in more extreme extremes, more heavy rainfall, heat waves, droughts and floods. I attended COP26 in Glasgow, and I wanted in these very brief opening remarks that before turning to the panel, to reflect on where we are now, where we're going and why we need action, so the rationale for today's discussion. So really some reflections on 1 year on from COP26. So where are we now? Well, the World Meteorological Organization's global annual and decadal climate update report indicated that our chances of reaching the 1.5 degrees threshold for dangerous climate change impacts in one of the next 5 years have never been higher. So there's a 50-50 chance that will occur. And it suggested that temperatures compared to the pre-industrial period would be between 1.1 and 1.7 degrees higher between 2022, so now, and 2026. Also, if we reflect on this summer's heatwave, where we had record observed temperatures in the UK of 40.2 degrees, that really highlights the need to mitigate and to adapt to the impacts of dangerous climate change. If we keep on the current trajectory, we expect that temperatures above 40 degrees C are likely to occur not 1 in 200 to 300 years, but 1 in every 15 years, so 1 in every 15 years by the end of the century. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has suggested that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2 degrees will save around 420 million fewer people being exposed to extreme heat waves. So that half-degree difference will put 500 million people in peril in relation to heat waves. So that's where we are. Where are we going? Well, the latest UN climate change report, which was published less than a month ago, shows that countries are bending the greenhouse gas curve downwards, but efforts really remain insufficient to limit global temperature to the rise of 1.5 by the end of the century. So according to that latest report, the combined climate pledges of the 193 parties under the Paris Agreement would put us on track for a warmer world of 2.5 degrees by the end of the century. Greenhouse gas emissions are still rising. It's important to recognise that. And current commitments that we've got will result in emissions increasing by just over 10% by 2030 when we compare those to 2010 levels. So we're really nowhere near where we need to be in terms of the pace and scale of emissions reductions that we need for a 1.5 degrees warmer world. The latest IPCC analysis indicates that carbon emissions need to be cut by 43% by 2030 to get us back on track. However, it should be noted that of the 193 parties making contributions, only 24 have updated their climate plans since COP26, and that is quite concerning indeed. So we need to take action. So we're faced with a climate crisis, and we really need to tackle this by making transformational change. We need new approaches at all levels, from policies within to international governing bodies and businesses, through to what we do in our own homes, in our own schools. and we must really reassess our relationship with the environment and change our understanding of how we work, travel and live together. So how will we do that? How will we facilitate that? How do we encourage change? Well, to move this debate on, that's the focus of the panel today. We want to think about the challenges and opportunities for change makers. The panel discussion will consider a range of different perspectives across academia, reflections from pressure groups and industry and from younger people, and we'll also take questions from the audience. In terms of the format for the event, I'm going to then ask in a moment each of the panelists in turn to give a 5-minute reflection on the question. They're going to do that without slides. And then following their opening remarks, I will chair a question and answer session from the audience. I would really encourage you, please, to take an active role in the webinar. Pose your questions using the Q&A function. And if you'd like to address your question to a particular member of the panel, please make sure you state that when you pose your question. On your screen, you'll see that the chat function is disabled. That's just so we can get all the Q&A onto the Q&A function and make the fielding of questions a bit easier. I'll then select the questions that come up in the Q&A and address them to the different panelists. Then at the very end of the event, I'm going to invite each panelist to provide a maximum of 2 sentences, please, their takeaway message around what would make the greatest change in terms of behaviours towards to addressing the climate crisis. So I'm really pleased to say that we have 5 panellists today, and I'll introduce them in turn and then ask them to make their remarks. So that's the format for the session, and we'll kick off with our first panellist. Our first panellist is Niheer Dasandi, and he is an associate professor in the School of Government here at the University of Birmingham. His research focuses on the health dimensions of climate change and the relationship between sustainable development and human rights. He's been part of the prestigious Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change since 2016, and he's currently the co-lead of the Politics and Governance Working Group for the Lancet Countdown on Europe. So Niheer, we're very interested to hear from you. How can we make real change to tackle the climate crisis?
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'll just start my stopwatch so that I know when 5 minutes is up. Thank you very much for having me. It's really great to be part of this event across both campuses too. So I'm gonna my response will focus on the need to treat climate change as a health issue, a public health issue, and beyond that, more of as a global public health crisis. And the reason for this is, at the moment, a lot of the actions that have been taken have been done so with fairly weak public support and fairly weak public engagement. So for those of us and those of you that are heavily involved in climate change, we feel, it's all encompassing. But if we look at the level of engagement, while generally people might be concerned about it, it's not a priority in people's lives, and understandably so with the current way in which climate change discussions take place. In the UK and other countries around the world, we're currently facing this cost of living crisis. So people clearly have other priorities. So focusing on climate change as a health issue can change this as it directly impacts people's lives. And it's already doing so. And I think that's the key thing. A lot of the projections are about things that will happen, by the end of the century. But focusing on climate change as a health issue, really highlights the fact that already we're seeing health impacts around the world in various ways. This might be people's exposure to heat and heat waves, which is rapidly increasing, and it's associated with, increasing kidney injuries, heat stroke, adverse pregnancy outcomes, worsening cardiovascular and respiratory disease, and a range of other negative effects. It's through the rising number of extreme weather events that we see around the world, such as wildfires, floods and droughts. And importantly, this not only impacts people's physical health, but it has even broader worsening effects on people's mental health around the world as well. And we're seeing growing evidence of that too. In terms of increasing the suitability of infectious disease transmission, we're seeing, increasing cases of things like malaria around the world, chikungunya, dengue, West Nile virus, Vibrio, Lyme disease, to name a few. And then, there's the impact it has on food security and nutrition as well, which is another channel through which climate change is impacting people's health. And one of the key issues when we think about climate change as a health issue is it's impacting people's health in all regions. I think there's been a tendency for some of us, particularly those of us in wealthier countries, to think we're somehow protected or We don't feel these effects in the same way. And while that's true in terms of, the effects of climate change are disproportionately felt by those in the poorest parts of the world who have contributed least to it, none of us will be left unexposed to these heat impacts. So as part of the Lancet's work, the Lancet Countdown's work in Europe, one of the big issues is heat-related mortality, particularly with Europe's aging population. We're seeing a growing number of cases of West Nile virus in Europe. So there are a range of impacts that I think are happening now, and sort of, really identify why we need to take action. But the other reason for focusing on health is that it really offers an opportunity to focus on the opportunities. There are a range of health benefits that are associated with mitigation actions, and this has been a big area of focus for those of us working on climate change and health. So examples would be, tackling or reducing fossil fuel consumption and greenhouse gas emissions would improve air quality, which would save millions of lives already. Switching away from motorized vehicles to active transport like bicycling, has been shown to improve people's health and people's quality of life. Switching away from red meat. So red meat and milk contributes over half of the agricultural sector's emissions each year. And again, there's huge health benefits. So that's the other reason we can really focus on the opportunities. And there is growing evidence, and part of the work I've been involved with has shown that, when we do frame climate change as a health issue, we see greater public engagement, we see greater public willingness to support some of these policies than we see otherwise. So it's really important to make that switch. And just to finish with, at the moment, we're a long way from that. So part of our work tracks indicators around, media coverage and individual engagement. And at the moment, while there's growing sort of media interest in this issue, a really small proportion of newspaper articles on climate change actually mention health. So there's a lot that can be done to really push that public engagement. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Niheer, for a really interesting perspective on climate change and physical and mental health. I think the really important point there about this affecting all regions of the world. We'll move to our second panelist, who is Michaela Marburg, who is a professor of corpus linguistics at the University of Birmingham. Her research focuses on the relationship between language and reality. She's editor of the International Journal of Corpus Linguistics, and with her team, she's developed the Click webpage for digital reading of fiction. And she hosts, and you may have seen this, the Life and Language podcast. So Michaela,
okay.
For you, how can we make real change to tackle the climate crisis?
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me. And how wonderfully planned that I'm right after Niheer, because one of the crucial points I wanted to start with is that making real change really requires that we tackle the climate crisis as a multi-dimensional problem. It is a complex crisis. There's no single solution, and therefore we must find ways to make connections between different problems. And we've just heard how you make a connection between the climate crisis and health issues, and you can make connections between different stakeholders, companies, governments, consumers, the person in the street. And I think one of the tools that we haven't sufficiently employed yet to deal with this complexity and to make the connections is language. We need to find better ways of talking about the climate crisis so that it matters, and we need to talk more effectively about solutions, and we need to be able to imagine futures that are worth fighting for. So now you might wonder, how is language going to help? I mean, that's a bit of a simplistic approach. Language has always been there. Everyone's got one. And that is exactly the point. The climate crisis is complex. It is all pervasive, and language is all pervasive too. So therefore, I think language really provides us with a useful tool in this climate quest. And a fundamental thing that language can do for us is give us insights into the social dimension. And again, that connects to the previous statement you heard. The climate crisis is a social crisis too. The environment is not a separate entity. It is where we live. It is where society takes place. And understanding language is key to understanding society. If you look at language closely, you will be able to see and get insights into these interdependencies and complexities. Shall we take an example of how language matters? And we can already take, topic of today, the climate crisis. What can we do? Not so long ago, people tended to talk about climate change. Then the realization set in that it's not really gradual or even acceptable change. Change kind of sounds still okay and is maybe not too uncomfortable, but there's a real crisis. So the words were adjusted to this new take on reality, so a new framing of our reality. This shows language matters. So we use language to make sense of the world. It shows us what we value, what we care about, what is close to our hearts. Going back to that example of climate crisis again, this is a big term. It is many things. For an individual person, it can almost be too much. Using that term creates a big topic that we can push to the sidelines of everyday life. So when you're sitting at the breakfast table in the morning and you get ready for work, you don't have time to think about the climate crisis. We need to find our phones, we need to get a coffee, we need to fill up the water bottle, get the children to school. That's not time for climate crisis conversation. That is for scientists and politicians. So here language creates distance. It is someone else's problem to deal with. But through language, we can also make these meaningful connections, so we can see how public health and climate belong together. An example that I've spent a lot of time looking at together with David and some other colleagues, and I think John might actually be in the webinar as well, is we looked at water. The word water is already quite different from climate because it can be more concrete in some ways. Now the thing with language is that even if we are speakers of a language, we might not be aware of everything we say, so or at least the detail of the words we use. So what we as linguists like to do, we like to look at the evidence. We want to see some hard facts of how we talk about stuff. And so we looked, for instance, at large collections of news articles, and there we found water meanings of a wide range. So there's mentioning of water sports. People talk about water breaks in football, probably quite a lot looking at what's coming in the next couple of weeks. There are articles where we talk about water cannons, water fountains, water bottles, brands, and there are articles that discuss how many glasses of water we should drink per day. Do you see how that connects already to public health? How much water should we drink per day? And also during the pandemic, there was reporting on increased water usage because people spend so much time in their hot tubs. Basically, you can find reference to water everywhere. Texts I find particularly interesting are, for instance, recipes. Recipes are not about climate change, but it makes a difference how you talk about food in various contexts. So you can cook with water, you can have recipes that are more vegetarian, vegan, all sorts of stuff. So now we can see how that link to the breakfast table and the climate crisis already matters. We make ourselves a coffee with water, we fill up a water bottle and we wash the dishes. What language shows here is what David mentioned earlier in this scientific context of water is the climate connector. What language shows is that meanings of water also connect to every aspect of society. In practice, we still don't do this enough. You heard from Niheer that the public engagement isn't great yet, but we can ramp this up, really. And the argument I'm making here about language and communication also connects to ideas we now see in climate journalism, where journalists argue that climate reporting as a separate activity is the wrong approach. We need to address connections to climate in every area of life, so every area of the news. And then once we understand how language is used, we can develop better communication to make connections that matter. And these connections we make through language. These are stories, and not just news stories. These connections are narratives about humankind. The climate crisis is not a separate topic in a section in a newspaper, a topic for one lesson in school. It's part of the big story. And there are always stories that matter to us, and there are stories that are far removed, stories that we're not interested in. What I'm talking about is the stories we want to be part of. I think to tackle the climate crisis, we need to add on another thing. So we need to use the language and tell the climate stories that everyone wants to be part of. And I leave it there.
Thanks, Michaela, for that perspective. Great to hear about the role of language and making meaningful connections and telling climate stories. Thank you. Our next panelist, the third one, is Morgan Roberts, who's a change maker. So Morgan is a recent MSci graduate in biochemistry, who has really been translating her passion for sustainability through her life, but also as a role within our external relations, our comms department there. And she's really, in that role, developed quite a comprehensive understanding of some of the networks we've got sustainability professionals within the universities, and to think about how we can work together to make behavioural change. So Morgan, over to you for your perspective.
Yes, thank you very much, David. So yeah, as David says, I've got various roles that I've had within the university as a student and now as a staff member. But to be honest, today, I think one of the ways that I'd like to give my perspective on this topic is actually as a Gen Z or a Gen Z. You know, my generation are not uniquely, but certainly particularly affected by the constant barrage of information the online world provides society. One consequence of this is constantly thinking about issues that not only affect ourselves and our families, but suddenly a much wider world of the people on the other side of the world, people in the future. But I want to bring a positive perspective to this and show how young people with access to so many perspectives are actually creating a generation of generalists, and take this opportunity to share with you all some things I've learned and thought about in the last year that I feel should be talked about more, and that fit well with the idea of how to make real change, and also with the ideas that Niheer and Michaela have made as well, which is great to hear. So my main thinkings all seem to circulate around systems and behaviour change, which of course is the main thing today. The speed of change is such a stress point for people in my generation. There's a lot of solutions that we have, but maybe don't know where to go with them. But I believe that the way me and my peers look at the problem could guide real change if we shifted a bit. So I want to start with a simple yet often underestimated point that scaremongering doesn't work for humans. I think that we should all be using lessons from behavioural psychology more. I'm by no means an expert, but the reading that I've done in the last year has made me realise that everyone should just take some time looking into behavioural psychology, because it will both surprise you but also make perfect sense that it's ingrained in humans to avoid discomfort. The fear-mongering that young people often use, but also everybody else uses about the climate space makes people pretty uncomfortable. Focusing on negative emotions, if you don't do something like fear and guilt, isn't very effective. And equally, telling people they have to give something up or lose something makes them resistant to listen and to change, which has been a personal experience of mine, and I'm sure we all have seen situations like this. So the counter to this is solution-based thinking, helping people visualize a positive situation and then providing them the tools to get there. Seems to be the most effective way to drive change. So it's pretty convenient that things that have been mentioned here, you know, slowing down the climate crisis can also have a huge number of benefits for us humans. So considering this and the ways that I can apply behavioural psychology to the climate crisis has made me realise something quite major, which is that I don't actually know what world I want to live in. If you asked me, paint a picture of the world you want to create, I don't think I could, but I could tell you a lot of problems that I think there are with the world at the moment. I bet many of you don't have a clear image of the world that you want either. So how many other situations in life do we work out the problems and start to tackle them without really working out where we want to end up? We fight fires, identify problems, attack people that we think are to blame. I'll note here, I am talking from a privileged position that I believe most of us here today are in, which is where we're not on the front lines every day. We're not fighting to survive, so that we do have more space to think like this. But all the solutions we've come up with in reports like keeping 1.5 degrees alive, the knowledge we have now, I think we really need to start thinking about where we're actually headed. It's a particularly important fact for young people, and I hope that my peers and I can start using our optimism to visualise the world we want to create. So let me clarify the difference here between having solutions and kind of visualising the future in the way that I'm talking about. So we realise that cars run on petrol or diesel, I know that's generally bad. We know they emit pollution. We know the kind of fuel we're using is finite and expensive and depends on political stability. So we think, okay, the pollution's bad, the fuel's bad, let's use a different fuel, let's make electric cars. This has great potential for lots of situations. You know, we don't have to change our lifestyles, we can still drive places, it's just the cars aren't as bad for the planet or our lungs. But as we all know, there are a lot of problems with electric cars. They're still expensive. Batteries need lithium, which has ethical and recycling problems. Recycling facilities are expensive. There's still too much traffic getting into work in the morning if we're all in cars. So what if, rather than fixating on cars and the solutions to fix them, why not focus on what we actually want? What if we think, okay, I want to be able to drop my child off at a good school in the morning and get to work without paying a fortune, get there on time, don't have to carry the pram, my work things, my lunch and everything else with me. But what I do want to do is do this in a way that makes sure that it promotes what's most important, which is my health, my kids' health and my happiness. And that will work for, and in a way that will work for a long time without hurting anybody else. So suddenly we start thinking about all the things a better transport system and different working environments and living environments could create. More efficient road systems where we're not stuck in traffic all the morning, communities that share essential amenities like prams or like cooking equipment. So there's less stuff in the world as well as our own houses. And ways of getting around that make us healthier, ways of eating at work that might save people money and time, but also bring people together. Now, I don't have all the answers right now, of course, but hopefully you can see how asking questions like where we want to be opens up the opportunity to explore solutions that are a lot more holistic and improve our lives more holistically rather than just getting rid of petrol, for example. So in this room, we all know things like education are important, that there are solutions and issues that we've already identified and generally what we need to tackle. What we don't seem to know is how to get other people on board. And it's brilliant to hear from the other panelists here today about other ways that we can get people on board as well. But my one thing would be go away today, think about what world you want to create. Chances are it's a pretty similar world to those around you, including the young people that you agree with, or the young people whose tactics you might not agree with, people who don't take the climate crisis seriously right now, or you think might never take the climate crisis seriously. Chances are you all want to create a pretty similar world. This isn't the whole solution, but it might help us realise that we all have common goals.
Thanks very much, Morgan, for your Gen Z perspective and thinking there about aspects of behavioural change, being solutions orientated, and some interesting imagined futures to reflect on. Move on to our fourth panellist. We've got Heather Mackay, who leads the UK Sustainable Finance team within E3G, and she works closely with business and investors to deliver transformative finance policies in the UK. She's been working to support the global ambitions of the UK in relation to COP, and has been involved in a number of leading campaigns around policy reform. She's very passionate, you'll hear, about finance and inclusion within climate thinking, and for the last 5 years has been working on aspects of energy and climate finance, as well as representing the UK on the Youth Task Force at the NDC Partnership. So Heather, over to you.
Thanks, David. And I have to say, coming after those three panelists is a tough job to follow, and I wholeheartedly agree. So I just wanted to pick up on something Morgan said to kick us off today, of what is our vision of a world we'd like to see by 2050 in order to tackle climate change. And for me, on my side, one thing I'm really passionate about is making sure that all finance flows across the global economy align with net zero. So no more dirty investments and lots of money available for the green and growth industries of the future. So given that it's COP27 going on at the moment, as well as the G20 summit and the World Leaders Summit last year, I've based a lot of my remarks around developments there, but I'll try and keep them brief because I have to say there's a lot going on. So firstly, I think the first thing to remember about finance is finance always seems like this very boring topic that no one really understands apart from bankers and government ministers. But for me, finance is actually the necessary bridge between a good idea and delivering action on the ground. So the COP26 president for the UK, Alok Sharma, said at COP Finance Day last week that without finance, nothing gets done. So it's one of the most important priorities for these global spaces to think about. However, as with most things that are important, it's easier said than done. Economies across the world are facing a poly crisis, The war in Ukraine is creating skyrocketing oil prices, energy security issues, cost of living issues, post-COVID recovery fiscal burdens to countries, and also perhaps most worryingly, severe and growing climatic shocks being seen across the world. I'm thinking of things like the floods in Pakistan, growing incidents of droughts, and the ever worrying biodiversity crisis. Zelensky, the Prime Minister of Ukraine, actually said at COP as well that with growing climate change comes a growing risk of war as well, and the climatic impacts of this, as well as mass displacement, are also very severe. This, I think, means that governments need to start thinking about investing in climate change not as an additional burden on the state, but actually as a solution to prevent a lot of these crises. Now, at COP, there's been some positive progress in the narrative. So loss and damage finance for countries that are impacted by the impacts of climate change is on the table for discussion. Adaptation finance is a growing conversation as well. And President Xi and Biden have also restarted the US-China Working Group on Finance and Climate. These are really important developments to try and kick off this conversation of how important finance is to solve climate change. However, I think we can all agree that discussions aren't enough given the state we find ourselves in. We can't roll out the solutions we need without getting the finance, investment and policy in place behind them. So we haven't seen much finance on the table at COP in terms of actual dollars being delivered for climate, for adaptation, or for loss and damage, but we've seen a lot of discussion. As I said, this needs to change. And we also can't think of these things in silos, as the speakers before me have highlighted. Adaptation, water usage, health issues, climatic issues and biodiversity are all, well, maybe not sides of the same coin, but all sides of the same ball, perhaps. So countries need to start recognising in more than rhetoric that climate finance and investment is the solution to these crises we face, and also to reflect Morgan's comments that it's an opportunity. There are huge growth potential. There's huge growth potential for economies across the world and new markets in green technologies and green solutions. And the private sector often is calling for government to help them unlock these opportunities. So we need to start that conversation, grow that conversation between what the private sector want to do, what governments are able to help support them with, and also the opportunities that will present for people across the world as well. To do this, we can't wait for COP. We can't wait for the discussions at COP to result in global agreements setting a global baseline. We need to see ambitious countries such as the UK taking progressive action now and leading the way on global financial reform. Two famous economists, Songwei and Stern, actually released a report at COP on the first day with a really strong call for global financial reform. So currently we have all these bits of global financial architecture that don't really speak the same language as climate action. They're really aimed at profit, and profit currently in modern thinking does not include things like the just transition, things like climate action, things like adaptation, things like biodiversity risk. This has to change. We're also really relying on voluntary commitments from the private sector to deliver a lot of the finance that we need for climate action. This is also not enough. Government and the private sector need to work hand in hand to make sure that the commitments that both governments and the private sector are making are credible, are clear, and also are consequential for mobilising finance. Again, this can't wait for COP. So 2.1c is this commitment within the initial Paris Agreement to make finance consistent with climate goals. This was meant to be discussed this year. It's not really being discussed, so it's been tabled to next year. So I'd really hope to see that next year countries really come out all in force to think about the ways to reform the global financial architecture for net zero, for climate change. This process needs to really think about what architecture we have at the moment, where are the gaps and where is it not working for climate change, and what can we do to solve those, and how can we get, at a very simple level, these all different institutions all talking to each other as well. Because I think one major issue that a number of actors across the system find is that everyone recognised climate change and ESG about 5 years ago and went on a little spree, set a bunch of standards, had a really nice time thinking about new and ambitious ways to solve the crisis and to mobilise finance. And now those conversations need to be brought together into a cohesive package with very, very clear global baselines on what different actors across the system have to do. Otherwise, we're going to see this fragmentation lead to a longer delay in actually getting us the finance to go where we need to go. The one last thing I'll say is about the UK. So the UK last year committed to really being quite progressive on finance. So we made transition plan requirements. So companies actually putting out a plan for how they plan to get to net zero, a mandatory requirement for listed companies in the UK. We also committed to creating the world's first net zero aligned financial centre, which to an E3G mind means a whole system of reforms around all the different pieces of the puzzle to getting us to net zero in the financial system. And I really think the UK could be a test case, so long as we do it well, for how these conversations might happen next year on 2.1c. So in summary, finance is the bridge between ideas and action. We need money now, and we can't wait for COP to get there and start mobilising. And the private sector will be really important partners in this, but the government needs to set the right guardrails and the right forward direction for them to actually participate meaningfully in the transition. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks Heather for a really interesting perspective, as you summed up well yourself, talking about the finance as the bridge to delivering on climate action, also introducing poly crises and the need for global financial reform. So we move on to our fifth and final but not least panellist, who's Mohammed Radfar, joining us from our campus in Dubai. He's the Programme Director for the MSc in Urban Planning in the School of Geography in Dubai. He's an urban designer and planner who's got a whole range of experience around landscape architecture and environmental planning, taking interdisciplinary approaches to his research and education, and also working in a multi-professional background. He's very interested in social sustainability and the role of community and people in making sustainable planning choices. So we're looking forward to hearing your perspective, Mohammed, on how can we make real change to tackle the climate crisis.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be the last one because I can, go over other colleagues' comments as well. It's very interesting because, starting from what Niheer said on the health issues, and then a storytelling of the language of Michaela, and then going into psychology, as Morgan mentioned, and then finally the finance. This is all point of my argument here, because I think all of these happens in a place. They're not isolated from a place. So to me, climate change is another place-based. We need to tackle climate change into with place-based approach. Without mentioning the urban growth rate, by 2050, we might have over 70% of the population live in urban context. We know, climate change is not only an urban issue, but I think urban context and the growth of, population in urban context is a major factor in that. So I want to put that in that context and saying, climate change is a place-based also problem. It's not isolated from place. We live, we life, and we do everything in a place. Often we don't look at it from that angle. We look at it from a variety of angles rather than put it in the place context. And it's a very local, actually. I understand it's a very global, issue, but we have to look at it as a global and in very small scale, even at the, neighborhood scale rather than, urban context. The whole, idea of storytelling and how we can, put all these, climate change issues together, I think can be nicely put into the place and place-based context. We have sense of place, which is directly into how we feel about the place. We have place connectedness, feeling insideness or outsideness of the place. Feeling connected or identified by a place. So if you put that in the climate change context, you see how we feel towards a place has a major role to feel towards the environment. So if I feel connected, I take more care. If I feel part of or, dependent on the place, I feel more care. So I think put it into psychology of place and put the whole idea into a place-based approach would help us to understand the climate change and the impact of climate change a lot better. Apart from the place, this is part of the social sustainability as well. So these two has, hand-to-hand impact on each other. The better social sustainability, the more care about the climate, the more, we know, some aspects of social sustainability. When you read throughout the literature about social sustainability, probably if you change the social sustainability and put climate change in that, it does exactly make sense again. So it's about equality, about diversity, interconnectedness, quality of life, democracy, health, education. So it's about, so the point is, going back to the beginning of the this session, climate change is very much multifaceted, multidimensional. It is, to me, very much place-based, and it has to be tackled in the place-based concept rather than, separating from it's about people and place connection. And that people and place connection is all about everything I just mentioned, from Niheer to Heather. I also work as a practitioner as well. Something I realized recently, I've got a project working on, and it doesn't matter how much I push towards climate change, sustainability, green space, etc., etc. It's the client and the finance behind that client. They push towards their profitability at the end, and I think that finance is key. How we finance and what we finance for, and how we can change that idea into something more relevant to climate change. I think I want to just finish it here, but again, climate change is a place-based issue.
Great, thanks, Mohammed. Anyone would think you're a geographer talking about the importance of people in place and in understanding the issues of tackling the climate crisis. Thank you very much for those reflections. So if I could ask the panelists to all turn your cameras on. We've got a series of questions that have come up through the Q&A. We've got about 50 minutes left. I will try and get through as many of these as we can. The first one I'd like to put out to Michaela. So you mentioned, comes up in the Q&A, that language is all pervasive, and as Morgan also said, we have busy daily lives. But the question is, so language might be all pervasive, but how do we actually use it for change? How do we implement it? And perhaps you could illustrate that in relation to what you were saying earlier about storytelling.
Yeah, maybe now that I've heard all the other brilliant contributions, immediately with some connections. If you look at what Morgan has said about the vision that we need, how do we imagine our future? This is something that is creative writing. If you look at climate writing, how do people think about utopias? How do people think about certain scenarios? You can do this with children, to do creative writing, to see what matters to them and how they would see this in the future. That's a very good example. Then to connect it to the health, how do you do this with language? When you have people talking about lifestyle choices, talking about water-related sports activities, that is the moment where you need to bring in a talk about the water crisis, in the sense of you are not going on your boat if there's no water where you are not drinking 6 glasses of water per day if there's no water that you could drink anymore. This also connects to, urban places, space, where do you belong? In old stories, people talked about places where they live in terms of, I live by the water. If there's no water anymore, where are you going to live? Underwater? What's the, so you can make all these connections. So I think there's plenty if you just try it out and use your creativity.
Great, thanks, Michaela. We've got a question for a planner next. So this goes to Mohammed. So the question says that I'm curious about the role of 50-minute cities or neighborhoods. If they're socially acceptable, and are they a viable choice in terms of sustainability for larger city centres? Oh, I think you're still on mute, Mohammed.
Absolutely. Well, I'm in Dubai, and if you want to buy a pint of milk, you have to drive 20 minutes. So, changing that habit into something different, I think, is key. So now in most of European cities and countries, we look at the 15 minutes, city, using walking, public transport, and providing all the services within the city. It's key, and there has been a lots of studies in that area, supporting the idea of transit-oriented, development and 15 or 20-minute city, or sometimes even people say 5-minute city. So yeah, absolutely, that would really, make a significant change.
Great, thanks, Mohammed. We've got one for Niheer next. It's asking about sort of heat wave related mortality. What can we really do in terms of adaptation? What could we implement when we think about the likely frequency of above 40 degrees, 1 in every 15 years in a future warmer world?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think it will really vary according to different places, but this is where there is these sort of balances and trade-offs with things like air conditioning and the importance of trying to keep buildings or design buildings in ways that at least can keep people cool, and there is a lot of work being done on that. But I think the other issue then is, in lots of lower income countries, the people that are most affected are workers, either agricultural or construction, and we're seeing huge amounts of a huge increase in mortality or heat related illness there. And it's a really tough one to know how we engage with those sorts of things. I mean, adaptation alone, I mean, there needs to be some sorts of adaptation, and that's where perhaps the finance comes in, and the need to compensate and provide that financing for lower income countries comes in. But equally, without efforts that also aim at mitigation, adaptation alone won't take us there, because if temperatures continue to rise, this is going to be a bigger issue. But yeah, absolutely, it's a really good question.
Thanks, Niheer. So the next question we've got is for Morgan. It's in two parts. The first is, how do we take action on climate change when we think that it's other people's problem to act? And do you have any reflections on balancing the emphasis between encouraging individual behaviour change versus larger businesses taking responsibility for action? So your reflections on that, Morgan. Quite a wide-ranging question.
Yeah, and a difficult one. So with regards to taking action when we feel like it's other people's problem, I think that that's again kind of about reframing the issue. When we talk about things like big oil being responsible for so much destruction or that sort of thing, especially in people in my generation and that sort of thing, we talk about that as such a it's such a difficult to reach area for us, so something that anybody can be particularly angry about and not really know what to do about it. And then we have kind of the basic level of, well, if I don't go on holiday or if I eat dairy, does that really make that much of a difference? So there's really this kind of separation between those two areas, but I think we need to realise that there's actually an in-between, and that's institutions like the university and other areas where we can, if we reframe the question, we can really easily see that everything that I do at the university, if everybody in my community is doing it, then that suddenly is a really easy way to see such a huge difference. So I think the way we frame that, and with regards to I guess, and that's the same kind of problem, individuals versus businesses, who needs to focus on change. I think listening to Mohammed, that's a really interesting point about Dubai that I hadn't thought about. Here in Birmingham, it's quite easy to go and walk to get your groceries rather than to drive, but there are places where behaviour change is just not going to be enough. Telling everybody that in Dubai or in the US or in Australia, areas where cities work differently, you can't, it's very impractical to just preach to people, I suppose. So you have to kind of take it case by case. But I think in Birmingham specifically, we just need to realise that that it is a joint problem. It is part of our responsibility. And I would recommend anybody to read about effective altruism. There's some really interesting statistics on eating meat. And actually, one person cutting down their meat once a week does make a difference to the supply chain, even if we don't think it does, that sort of thing. So effective altruism, I definitely recommend.
Thanks, Morgan. So we've got a question for Heather now. The first comment there is they really like the concept of polycrisis and thinking about how we deal with that. But the question is framed around, how do we, and you mentioned this about not waiting, how do we deal with the volatility and uncertainty in terms of making decisions? Particularly in the context of the global financial reform that you suggested. How do we make choices that might not limit our options as we head into the future?
That is such a good question, and again, a very challenging one. I think the idea is to perhaps not look at the climate crisis in terms of everything stops overnight, because that's just not realistic. It's not realistic for developing countries, and it's certainly not realistic for developed countries either. We need to think of this as a transition. So and again, that's good for two reasons. One, it sets out a roadmap for all actors across the state, including consumers. I mean, just to pick up on Morgan's point, quite interestingly on behaviour change, the UK government, as part of their net zero strategy, released and then deleted a chapter on behaviour change. I'm sure someone can find it somewhere in the audience. So that's a roadmap for consumers about what they can think about doing going forward to make their lives more sustainable. You can also have things like transition plans, so setting out really clear guidance what companies have to do to reach net zero in a managed way that doesn't cause a financial crash overnight. And finally, NDCs. So again, getting countries to think about what their approach is over time, given their own domestic contexts. The one thing I would say with all of these is that there needs to be oversight and transparency on all of these plans. It's really important that the private sector is held to account on the transition plans they are making, because it is inevitable that those might be weaker than they should be. And countries need to be held to account on their own transition as well. And I think that happens through venues like COP every single year. And I think finally what I would say is to help, particularly I think the question focused on kind of developing economies. It's really important that developed economies recognise the role we have to play in mobilising finance and providing support and technical know-how to help these countries shift to a more climate-friendly path, and also deal with the inevitable impacts of climate change we're going to see already. There have been some really positive initiatives like JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. However, that can't be done for every single country all over the world, because it takes apparently a bloody long time to do one of them. So we need to think about, again, that kind of structural reform. How can we create packages of support with things like technical assistance, product development support, hubs for businesses and local and economies across the world to come to and seek financing, and also a diplomatic space for countries to talk about what issues they're having in transitioning their energy systems away from dirty fuels to clean fuels as well. But I think, again, to sum up, I think the volatility aspect will come if we don't actually proactively create transition plans for all these different actors and start action now, because it's just going to get worse if we leave it.
Great. Thank you very much, Heather. So we're running up to time. There's quite a few more questions in the chat around everything from the energy transition to disinvestment in fossil fuels, to planning, to aspects of health and our roles as game changers. But we'll have to hold it there. I'll pass them on to the panel afterwards. So if we could round off the session, if everyone would keep their cameras on, so I can see the reactions of the other panelists to your comments. And I'm going to ask everyone for just 2 sentences, please, on your takeaway message of what you think would make the greatest change in terms of behaviours or changes towards tackling the climate crisis. And we'll go in the same order that we did for the introductions. So if we start with Niheer, your 2-sentence summary, please.
That's not an easy task, but sort of building on what a lot of the speakers have said, and also that last question by Nigel on political will. I think, one of the things is I think there is still fairly weak public engagement, and I think that's because we haven't done a great job of communicating issues around climate change to the public. So I think really building that support, and I think the things that Michaela mentioned and others have mentioned, I think there has to be a balance between the sort of impacts and the threat that climate change poses with a focus on the opportunities and the sort of transition to living in spaces that we would all really enjoy to live in, and it's part of that. It's sort of balancing that message as well and getting that across, I think is really important. And sort of as Morgan said, I think those sorts of things are really important, the narrative we use.
Great, thanks Niheer. So talking about narratives, we'll move on to Michaela.
Yeah, I think really vital is that we take the big problem and really bring it closer to home in terms of society, in terms of place, in terms of making it felt by the individual. So use our ability to work with language and then tell stories that people are not necessarily scared of, but want to be part of.
Great, thank you. Short and snappy and sound-biteable for sure. Morgan.
Yes, just basically the same stuff again. Yeah, everybody should really go home and think about the world that they want to create and try and work out how they can get there. And when I say everybody, I don't necessarily mean on an individual perspective. I mean, I do, but that doesn't have to only be relevant for us as individuals. That's what we need to do to make the system change. Because, yeah, go home and think about what world do you want to create.
Thanks, Morgan. Great message. Heather.
I think on my side, you might be surprised. Finance. I think that I know finance can be quite a tricky topic, and especially when I was doing youth campaigning for years, it was always one of those topics that either ideologically or on a more academic understanding people would shy away from. But it's so important that we all upskill ourselves on what needs to happen to kind of create this context in which finance can flow for net zero. I think we should hold private companies' net zero commitments to account and really call on our governments to make sure that those are regulated. And finally, on a non-finance note, just to shake the boat, ban private jets. They're bad for everyone. Sorry, Leo, you can't have one anymore. Sorry, Taylor, not for you. I think they really undermine public trust. But I think more importantly, finance.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Heather. And Mohammed, your takeaway messages on making the greatest change to tackle the climate crisis.
Okay, let's very quickly, I always use the example of my grandmother. She used to live in a small town in, central Iran. She had electricity, but never find the urge to use it. She had all the, modern facilities, but she never used it. She woke up with the sunrise, go to bed with the sunset. So I think that's key, change of culture, change of, behavior, and living with nature and accept the limitation of the nature. That's what we don't do nowadays. We think we can create Dubai out of sand. Okay, we can, but what's the point? Living with nature, understanding the nature, and living with the limitation of the nature. We don't have to change the world into something, finance, okay, it's needed, but why do we do all these things? I think it's going back to again, culture, connection with place, and living with nature. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was in UNESCO 2 weeks ago for their thinking about the just transition, and they said exactly the same. Living with nature and thinking about culture and indigenous knowledge and how we can perhaps recreate some of that. So we're running up to time now. As I mentioned earlier, this is an event hosted between our Edgbaston and our Dubai campuses. And before I thank everyone, I'd just like to give Rasha Bayoumi, the head of research in Dubai, the opportunity to perhaps make a couple of final comments or observations. Rasha, over to you.
Well, from my perspective, I really like the idea of putting all of these together in a multifaceted, multinational way of looking at and providing a solution-based approach towards moving forward. So I think it's sometimes when we work in silos, we lose sight of the bigger picture and how we can collectively actually come up with solutions that can help address this very much global issue from, as some of you said, we start off on the individual basis, but we have to work collectively. And I just really wanted to emphasize the involvement of all stakeholders, because I think someone asked, is it just the individual? Is it the companies? It has to be all the stakeholders. This affects all of us. And so we all have to work collectively towards addressing it and really being solution focused. And all of us as academics can, provide that research base to provide those solutions.
Great, thanks, Rasha. Thanks for a super summary and pulling this strings together, building bridges and joining up silos is critical as we move forward at a range of different scales. So that's the old Joe clock tower here on the Edgbaston campus has just chimed, so that is 1 o'clock UK time. So on that note, I'd like to thank all the panelists for their really fascinating perspectives and the audience, which has been global today, for the really engaged discussion in Edgbaston and Dubai, but also elsewhere. So thank you very much to the panelists, thank you to the audience, and also thank you to Caroline Durbin, who's provided outstanding comms support and made everything run so smoothly today. So thank you all, and maybe you'll go away with some thoughts today about what you can do, what your organisation can do about taking action on the climate crisis. I think we've got a final slide to share, which points you to some more information relating to the work that the University of Birmingham is doing around climate related research and sustainability, and putting that research into action, and a link to our Birmingham Institute for Sustainability and Climate Action. And we'd be very interested in you engaging with us there. So have a good rest of the day, and thank you very much for joining us. Thanks again to the panel and the audience and the support. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.